Police make more arrests in Austria following a series of shootings last night in Vienna. 4 people died and many more were injured after gunmen shot people in bars and restaurants across the city. The Austrian Chancellor described the shootings as cold-blooded and an Islamist terror attack.
It was an attack of hatred. Hatred of our basic values. Hatred of our way of life. Hatred of our democracy, where all people are equal in rights and dignity.
I saw the heavily armed attacker with a rifle take aim and shoot at people outside bars and pubs last night. It was a warm evening and the night before the lockdown, so a lot of people wanted to go out.
We'll be getting the latest live from Vienna and getting reaction from our security correspondent. Also this lunchtime, the city of Liverpool becomes the first place in England to undertake mass testing for coronavirus. The campaigning is over. It's finally election day in the United States. Some polls have already opened as voters choose between Donald Trump and Joe Biden for president. Criticism of the government's decision not to allow grassroots sports to continue through lockdown in England. And going home, the koalas of Kangaroo Island are being returned to the bush after the devastating wildfires.
And coming up on BBC News, England's cricketers prepare to enter another bio-bubble as their squads to tour South Africa are announced, with Captain Owen Morgan warning of the mental toll it can take.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Police in Austria have made 2 further arrests following a suspected Islamist terror attack in the capital Vienna last night. At least 4 people were shot dead. The Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, said the victims were murdered in cold blood. He called it an attack born of hate. At least 1 gunman opened fire in the city centre at around 8 o'clock local time. It happened near Vienna's main synagogue as people gathered in bars and restaurants hours before the start of new coronavirus restrictions. Leaders from around the world, including Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, have condemned the attack. Some viewers may find some of the images in this report from our security correspondent Frank Gardner distressing.
Vienna under attack. Armed police reacted swiftly to reports of gunmen rampaging through the centre of the city, shooting at people indiscriminately as they sat in cafes and bars. This mobile phone footage shows the moment one of the gunmen opened fire. Police later shot dead one of the attackers and arrested another. The shooting took place close to the central synagogue. The rabbi saw what happened.
I saw the heavily armed attacker with a rifle take aim and shoot at people outside bars and pubs last night. It was a warm evening and the night before the lockdown, so a lot of people wanted to go out.
Police have identified the dead gunman as a 20-year-old resident of Balkan origin. His home's been searched and material linked to ISIS recovered. Today, Austria's Chancellor made this announcement.
It has been confirmed that yesterday's attack was clearly an Islamist terrorist attack. It was an attack of hatred, hatred of our basic values, hatred of our way of life, hatred of our democracy, where all people are equal in rights and dignity.
Austria's investigation is focusing on who else could have been behind this, the country's worst terrorist attack in 35 years. For residents of this normally tranquil city, it's been a brutal shock.
They need to be punished very harshly. That's not funny. It's unacceptable.
It's terrible what happened, but I guess it was foreseeable after everything that happened in other countries in recent years.
All this just days after France suffered its own terrorist attacks at a church in Nice, and before that, when this teacher, Samuel Paty, was beheaded by a jihadist after showing his class cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in a lesson about free speech. Those cartoons and the French government's subsequent crackdown on Islamist extremists triggered mass demonstrations in some Muslim-majority countries. French goods are being boycotted in several places. Today, Austria is in mourning, not just for those killed in last night's attack, but also for the end of a long period of relative calm. And yet, incredibly, as mayhem reigned last night, the Vienna Philharmonic were locked in by the police and they played on. A symbol, perhaps, of Europe's determination to stand up to terrorism. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
Well, our correspondent Bethany Bell is in Vienna for us and fears that that death toll could rise.
Yes, indeed. A number of people in critical condition in hospitals, and this city really in a state of shock today. In recent years, Vienna had escaped the kind of large-scale attacks that we've seen in Paris, in Berlin, in London, but now it has been the victim of what Austria's Chancellor Sebastian Kurz called a repulsive terrorist attack. Now, the square behind me where I'm standing now is where some of the shootings took place last night. And if I just stand aside, you can see police officials combing the area to look for signs of evidence. This city really in a state of shock. People have been warned to stay at home. The police fear that there could be still accomplices at large. They're still looking for people. A number of arrests have been made. We've also heard a little bit more about the gunman who was killed, again, very close to where I'm standing now. He's understood to be an Austrian dual citizen with of North Macedonian origin as well. He had already served a jail sentence for terrorist activity and was released early last year from jail because of his very young age. He was 20 years old.
Bethany, thank you very much. Well, let's speak to our security correspondent Frank Gardner, and given that information, do we know who is behind this attack?
Well, the jihadist in question there, who Bethany was just mentioning, was on a European watch list. He had reportedly tried to go to Syria. He was one of 90 Austrians who were trying to travel to Syria for extremist purposes. So UK and other authorities knew about him. The police didn't think that he was necessarily an imminent threat. Now, the big question, of course, in all of this is, are there other people behind this? Were these 1, 2 or 3 people? They still don't know for certain. Were they operating on their own, or were they directed by a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda in the way that the Bataclan attacks in Paris in 2015 were directed? And that's one of the things that they're focusing on now. This all comes at a time of great tension, because if you look at what's been happening in France, and we referred to it there in the report, it's a time where tempers are high, because there is a feeling that, certainly in France, that the government is trying to defend its secularist republic. The fact that that teacher showed those cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad was very insulting to many people. You saw the demonstrations. This all helps extremists win over other people to their cause. When things die down a bit, it's harder for them to recruit. Now, the one ray of hope is that we are seeing a lot of lockdown now over Europe. And if there aren't people out on the streets, sure, people can start planning, but there aren't many things that they can do.
Frank, thank you very much. Regular coronavirus tests are to be offered to everyone living and working in Liverpool from the end of this week. It's the government's first mass testing trial involving a whole city. Liverpool has one of the highest rates of coronavirus deaths in England. Our health correspondent Catherine DeCosta reports.
It's estimated 2/3 of us get the virus without showing any symptoms. Liverpool's had some of the highest infection rates. It's hoped by testing the whole city, authorities will be able to monitor the spread of the virus and quickly drive infections down.
We know that asymptomatic transmission is a key issue for us. So the more we can get people to help people to understand their personal status, the more we can encourage people to act appropriately and accordingly.
So it's 10 seconds each side.
From Friday, existing swabs and new rapid swab tests, which can provide results within 15 minutes, will be offered to people with or without symptoms every week or so at 30 testing sites around the city.
They're going to be outside some hospitals, going to be outside the universities, outside our schools. Going to have mobile units going to care homes as well, and to other places where we see there's a spike or an increase in COVID-19 activity.
Around 1 in 1,000 people will get a false positive, meaning someone's told they've got the virus when they haven't. But scientists say rapid tests could be a game changer.
You know, people get pretty irritated when they get told that they passed somebody in the shops and they now have to quarantine for 10 or 14 days. And with these tests, it should be possible, as we get the system in place, to be able to test those people every 2 days, and they can go about their business provided they remain negative.
2,000 military personnel will be deployed from Thursday to help plan the logistics and deliver some of the tests.
If this is a success, and I obviously really hope that it will be and that people in Liverpool will get behind it, then we'll be looking to roll this out in other towns and cities and make millions more of these rapid tests available before Christmas.
The latest weekly figures from national stats agencies shows deaths in the UK are more than 10% higher than expected in the week to the 23rd of October. There were more than 12,000 deaths, and almost all the excess, seen here in red, was linked to COVID-19. Back in Liverpool, the pilot will be closely monitored to see how many people come forward for testing and how many fully isolate when they're asked to. Catherine Da Costa, BBC News.
Well, Liverpool's hospitals are continuing to face major challenges. The city's University Hospitals Foundation Trust is currently treating around 450 people with COVID. That's more than at the peak of the pandemic in April. Our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, has been speaking to patients and staff.
If you're wondering how the NHS might struggle this winter, look no further than Liverpool. Staff at the Royal Liverpool say they're under more pressure now than in the spring.
What way are you going in there?
And it's not just this city. In the past week, around 10 critically ill patients had to be transferred between hospitals in the Cheshire and Mersey region because units ran out of beds.
It is extremely concerning. It is a symptom of the stress the system is under. It is a big warning to us all. We do not normally see these numbers of non-clinical transfers.
The nation is no longer clapping for carers. That shared moment of solidarity is gone. Now there's disagreement over whether restrictions are needed.
I get why people are frustrated and I get why people are angry. We see it on a different level being here in intensive care. We're seeing people who are sick, really sick, patients are dying of COVID. Not everybody in the community sees that, so I understand the disbelief.
Health service leaders were determined to keep all services going this winter. But Liverpool University hospitals have cancelled nearly all non-urgent surgery, such as joint replacements and hernia repairs.
Half the operating theatres across Liverpool University hospitals, like this one, are closed due to COVID-19, mostly so that staff can be redeployed to intensive care. So coronavirus is impacting on patients with a whole range of medical conditions.
Most cancer treatment is continuing as normal, but the shortage of intensive care beds has meant a few urgent cancer operations have had to be postponed. Staff say it's devastating for patients and warn things will get worse unless the virus is kept in check.
We're very close to the limit of what Liverpool hospitals can cope with in terms of the number of patients with COVID in the hospitals, and particularly what we can cope with without having to postpone more of those urgent surgical procedures.
It's not too bad. Jay is just 44, a freelance writer. He's had blood clots on his lungs due to COVID. His breathing is still laboured.
You can't take this as a joke or something like that. It's not real. You could get something serious.
So your oxygen's up there.
All the doctors, nurses and patients I met had the same message. Don't dismiss coronavirus. Don't neglect hand hygiene. And above all, keep social distancing. These are the fundamentals behind controlling COVID this winter. Fergus Walsh, BBC News, Liverpool.
Well, at Westminster, there are continuing questions about the government's furlough scheme for workers. Our political correspondent Jessica Parker joins me now, and pressure to outline some form of long-term support for businesses.
Yeah, that's right, Simon. I mean, wind back to the weekend when, of course, we learnt that England would go into a further lockdown from Thursday. And we also learnt that the furlough scheme would be extended for that month. So the government will fund up to 80% of people's wages where they can't work because of COVID restrictions. But that sparked some anger because the furlough scheme was only extended as England was set to go into lockdown, and some questions as well. So should Wales or Scotland in future beyond December decide they need to go into some form of lockdown? Will full furlough be forthcoming? Boris Johnson yesterday in the Commons seemed to suggest that would be the case, but we've had very little detail. And this morning, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, has said she is seeking urgent clarity on the matter. We've heard from Downing Street in the last hour. They're saying if other parts of the UK decide to go into measures that require direct economic support, that will be made available. But it's still not 100% clear what that means. There's a question here, I think. Is the Treasury perhaps reluctant to write a blank cheque for future lockdowns that will have no control over? But regardless, as you say, there is pressure on ministers to clarify things, and if they don't, I think they could face accusations that they appear ready to splash the cash when England's set to go into lockdown, but less so when it comes to making future guarantees for other parts of the United Kingdom.
Jess, thank you very much. Just after 1:15, our top story this lunchtime. Police make more arrests in Austria following a series of shootings last night in Vienna. Coming up, the race for the White House will examine what impact today's US election could have on relations with the UK, especially during Brexit.
Coming up on BBC News, Hull KR end their Super League campaign early, saying they're unable to field a team for their last 3 games after more positive coronavirus results in the latest round of testing, on top of a string of injuries.
It's election day in the United States, and polls have started to open for the presidential election. Donald Trump and his Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, spent the final hours of the campaign in the swing states that could decide the result. National polls suggest a firm lead for Mr. Biden, but the race is tighter in the key battlegrounds. More than 98 million people have already taken part in early voting, as Ben Wright now reports.
Across the United States, in person and by mail, Americans have voted in vast numbers already. Nearly 100 million people have cast their ballots early, and more will have their say at polling stations today. For both candidates, Monday saw a final sprint for votes around key swing states, and both made campaign stops in Pennsylvania. Lagging in the polls, Donald Trump has been rallying his supporters at a punishing pace. The president surprised the world by winning 4 years ago and believes he can do so again.
So get your friends, get your family, get your neighbors, get your co-workers, grab your boss by the tie and say, come on, boss, we got to get out and vote, get out and vote. And you're going to have a day tomorrow, the likes of which I think people haven't seen in a long time.
His Democratic rival Joe Biden has also been campaigning intensely in Pennsylvania, arguing America must come together and get a grip on the pandemic.
The first step to beating the virus is defeating Donald Trump.
It always matters who sits in the White House, but the choice facing Americans today is stark. This feels like the most pivotal presidential election in decades, and the huge early voting turnout reflects that. It is also a big test for America's democracy and whether it can peacefully steer this nation through a deeply polarized moment. Lady Gaga joined Joe Biden at a drive-in campaign event in Pittsburgh. After decades in public life, Mr. Biden could be on the cusp of the presidency. Donald Trump is in the fight of his life, still thrilling his crowds, still predicting possible bedlam after the election. This evening he stopped in Wisconsin before wrapping up his travels in Michigan. A campaign going to the wire. Ben Wright, BBC News, Washington.
Well, our correspondent Lebu DeSecco is at a polling station in Arlington in Virginia. And what is the mood like today?
Well, it's been a pretty slow but steady stream of voters at this polling station here. I was lucky enough to speak to some of the first people in the queue. They told me that they'd seen the huge queues right around the country for early voting. They wanted to avoid that, and that's why they came out so early today. As Ben said in his package, we have seen record-breaking numbers of people voting early, more than 70% of the total number of people that voted in 2016. Early voting traditionally tends to favour Democrats, and Donald Trump will really be wanting his voters to come out in force today, particularly because he has consistently undermined the safety of postal voting. There's no evidence that it is unsafe, but he has said that repeatedly. Now, the one thing I do think is pretty certain or pretty clear is that it will be quite a while before we know what the results are. This state, Virginia, has up until the 6th of November for postal votes to arrive. Pennsylvania does not start processing postal ballots until today. They have quite a number of those to get through. So I think it'll be quite a while before we know the results and what is going to be an extraordinary election.
Lebo Di Secco, thank you very much. Well, how will the US election result affect the country's relationship with the UK, especially during Brexit? Our reality check correspondent Chris Morris is here and has been finding out. Chris.
Thanks, Simon. There are some long-standing relationships between the United States and the UK on things like security, intelligence and defence, which are going to continue no matter who wins the presidential election. But politics matters, and it's worth asking what the election could mean for this country as it moves into a post-Brexit world. Some European governments suspect Boris Johnson is waiting to see the political outcome in the US before deciding whether to push for a trade deal with the EU this year or settle for no deal. Downing Street has denied this, with the Prime Minister saying specifically the two things are entirely separate. But there's not much doubt that while Mr Trump might be enthusiastic about no deal and a more radical UK split with the rest of Europe, Mr Biden is not. He thinks Brexit was a mistake, and his position will be much closer to the EU, and more specifically the Irish view of what Brexit means. Mr Biden is aligned with the powerful Irish lobby in Congress, which would take a very dim view of any attempt to roll back the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the Brexit withdrawal agreement. And that matters for the UK's separate trade negotiations with Washington. Last year, the US accounted for 20% of UK exports and 13% of UK imports. But congressional Democrats have said there'd be little hope of an early free trade deal with the UK if the Brexit agreement on Ireland isn't respected. Donald Trump has been pushing to get that trade deal done, but whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, any president is going to strike a hard bargain. And that's one of the reasons why personal relationships matter. Donald Trump has repeatedly boosted Boris Johnson and called him Britain Trump. Joe Biden seems to agree with that description, but in a less flattering way. After the Prime Minister won last year's general election, Mr Biden called him a physical and emotional clone of the president. And plenty of influential Democrats feel the same. Ben Rhodes, who was Barack Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor when Mr Biden was Vice President, recently wrote on Twitter, "I'm old enough to remember when Boris Johnson said Obama opposed Brexit because he was Kenyan." So if Mr Biden wins, some bridge building might be needed. But next year, the UK will play a big global role, chairing both the G7 group of industrialised nations and the big UN climate summit COP26. A starring role in restoring cooperation between Western allies and joint leadership on climate change could mean past disagreements are quickly forgotten. Donald Trump's views on climate change, on the other hand, might be far more difficult for the UK to manage. So you can find pluses and minuses, whoever wins. But under President Trump, the Johnson government has been America's best friend in Europe. If it's to be a Biden presidency, though, the UK would be heading into a new relationship with Europe, with a very different administration taking office in Washington. Simon.
Chris, thank you very much. And you can join us tonight from 11:30 p.m. for our US election special results programme on BBC One. and the BBC News channel also covering it. You can follow all the expert analysis online as the results come in at bbc.co.uk/news and on the BBC News app. There'll also be coverage across BBC Radio 4 and the World Service from 10 p.m. and 5 Live from midnight. The Wales manager, Ryan Giggs, has denied an allegation of assault and says he's cooperating with police inquiries after he was arrested on suspicion of assaulting his girlfriend. And in the past few minutes, it's been announced Giggs won't be involved in the upcoming international camp for the Wales team. Let's speak to our sports news reporter, Laura Scott. And what do we know at this stage, Laura?
Well, what we know is that it emerged that shortly after 10 p.m. on Sunday night, police were called to reports of a disturbance at Ryan Giggs' home in Salford. The former Manchester United player was arrested on suspicion of actual bodily harm and assault, but he's been released on bail pending further inquiries. According to Greater Manchester Police, a woman in her 30s, believed to be Giggs' girlfriend, sustained minor injuries but didn't require further treatment. A statement on behalf of Giggs' representative said that Mr. Giggs denies all allegations of assault made against him, that he's cooperating with the police and will assist them in their ongoing investigation. Now, the Football Association of Wales postponed a squad announcements this morning, but as you say, in the last few minutes, they've said that for the next few games, 3 games against the United States, Finland and the Republic of Ireland, Wales will be without Ryan Giggs, saying our agreed immediate priority is preparing the team for the upcoming international matches.
Laura, thank you very much. Sports coaches have criticised the government's decision to suspend all children's grassroots sport outside of school during England's coronavirus lockdown. They say the measures could leave a generation of youngsters inactive. Elite sport, though, will continue behind closed doors during the lockdown. Our sports editor Dan Rowan reports.
The man in form, Jamie Vardy, sets up Harvey Barnes.
Elite sport, like Premier League football, won't be affected by England's second national lockdown. Leicester City beating Leeds United last night at the start of another full month of fixtures. But at the grassroots, there's more of an impact. The government confirming all organised community sport will stop under the new restrictions.
Unfortunately, if we're going to make a success of these national measures, they do have to restrict the amount of interaction we have with others, and that does mean ensuring that we restrict the amount of competitive or team sport that's going on.
Here at Macclesfield FC, a host of local kids teams have been allowed to train on the Moss Rose pitch this week. Pundit and former Wales player Robbie Savage, who also coaches a junior side, told me youth sport should be exempt.
For me, it's a huge part of their education, the mental health, the physical well-being of all these youngsters. For this to be taken away from them at this time is, for me, it can be so damaging.
The government insists stopping grassroots sport is needed to reduce transmission and mixing of households, but those involved insist social distancing by parents means there's minimal risk.
We do it for fun, we do it to win, we do it to play with our team, we make new friends. It's just an amazing part of our life, and if it goes, everyone's going to be really upset.
Scenes like this are about to be put on hold on grassroots pitches throughout England for the next month at least, and the fear is that the suspension of youth sport will have a damaging impact on youngsters' physical and mental health at a time when the amount of PE and sport in schools has been reduced because of the pandemic. Having suggested golf and tennis may be exempt from the rules, today the government clarified there would be no reprieve, and there's mounting anger from other sports too at the impact of another shutdown.
We are going to lose so many community facilities. You know, we've already lost 200 pools that will never reopen, and I fear every time that we go into lockdown, we're going to end up with these facilities just disappearing forever.
Ministers say exemptions risk undermining adherence to the rules, and this is only for a month. But the pausing of grassroots sport is proving an especially controversial element of this second lockdown. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
This time last year, bushfires were raging across Australia, causing widespread damage and devastation, and as well as claiming more than 30 lives, the country's wildlife was also badly hit. The koala population was decimated, and ever since, volunteers on Kangaroo Island near Adelaide have been doing their best to help them recover. From there, Shaima Khalil reports.
They survived Australia's fires. Now, these koalas are ready to go back where they belong. It's a very different scene from nearly a year ago. Pictures of the badly burned animals shocked the world. Hundreds were brought to this wildlife park when the flames tore through the island.
As well as being faced with the burns and the starvation and the dehydration, they were also very mentally affected as well. A lot of them were just feeling so terrible that they were just kind of cuddled in a ball. They didn't have that fight response which a wild animal should.
Of the 50,000 koalas living on Kangaroo Island before the bushfires, it's feared most of them were killed. Images of the destruction and the loss of wildlife were seen across the globe, prompting millions of dollars in donations.
It was just incredible to see how many people from pretty much every country in the world jumped on board to donate to looking after and saving as much wildlife on Kangaroo Island here as we could.
Helping koalas survive here is vital for Australia's ecology. It's the one place where the animals are disease-free. For months now, hundreds of koalas have been looked after in the wildlife park, and it's been a long and tough journey for many of them. The aim is to get them strong enough to survive on their own here in the wild. And today, one of them is being released. After 10 months of care, it's time for Merton's big move.
Ready? You're watching? Here goes the koala. Oh, here he goes.
For Dana, it's a bittersweet separation.
There's no better feeling watching someone that you've helped either raise from a joey or get through all of that treatment and then get them back out to the wild, watching them climb back up the tree where they're meant to be.
It'll take years for the island to recover, but it's hoped koalas like Merton can still thrive in a much-changed habitat.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, koala.
Bye-bye, koala.
Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Kangaroo Island.
It's hello to Helen Willits. She's got the weather.
Simon, thanks. Worth noting that we've got a major hurricane barreling into Nicaragua and Honduras at the moment, so do keep an eye on that. More available, of course, on the news channel. Here in the UK, things are quietening down. We've had some stormy, very wet weather. We've still a handful of flood warnings out because of because of all the rain that we've seen, but those should be ebbing away in the next couple of days. Why? We're inviting high pressure in from the Atlantic for the 3 or 4 days for most of us before it drifts away. So that's 3 or 4 decent days of drying weather to enjoy the autumn colours if you get out for a short walk, and also to exchange our gales and our rain for frost and fog. Now, we've already had a little bit of wintriness over the hills, and these showers across Scotland continue today here through Northern Ireland, western fringes. We've got the rain that we woke up to in the east clearing away as well, but look at the temperatures. They're, well, 6 to 8 degrees down on those of yesterday. So it feels chilly. The winds also are a notch down, it has to be said. Now, as we go through this evening and overnight, the showers do fade in many areas. The winds fall virtually light across the southern half of the UK. So for most of England and Wales, it will be our first widespread frost of the season overnight tonight. Waking up to some frost on the cars first thing tomorrow morning, potentially a little bit of mist and fog around, also quite chilly for the far south of Scotland and for the Northern Ireland area. But for the north of Scotland here, we've got just a bit more cloud, and that will be the theme tomorrow as well. In fact, we'll pick up more cloud and some rain here later in the day, but for most, just a few showers in comparison with today. Very isolated. Most places will escape them once the fog has cleared away. Then we'll see plenty of sunshine. Lighter winds than today, so it won't feel as chilly, but fog will become more of an issue then as we go through tomorrow night. Another really cold night across England and Wales, not as cold for Scotland and for Northern Ireland, but Thursday morning instead will dawn a foggy one. Now, again, it could be our first widespread issue with fog on the faster routes in particular, because at this time of year, it doesn't really clear much before mid to late morning. In fact, in some areas, it could linger all day. And if it does clear, it's going to be cold. Not so much an issue on Thursday for Scotland and Northern Ireland, just a bit more low cloud drifting around here. But where it does clear, we'll see 11 or 12 degrees. As I say, though, the high pressure's with us for a few more days, so the fog and frost issues drift a little bit further north, but at least it stays dry for most of us until probably the end of the weekend, Simon.
Helen, thank you very much. And that is all from the BBC News at 1. We now join the BBC's news teams on BBC One, where you are. From me, a very good afternoon.